On April 25, 2016, General Secretary of the CPC Central Committee Xi Jinping made a visit to Xiaogang during an inspection tour of Anhui Province. It was the first time Xi had set foot in this modest yet historically important village, although as a young man 38 years earlier, he had certainly spent time in Anhui.
这次到安徽来考察，专门到小岗村来看一看，这也是我的一个心愿。我是在1978年我来过这里，就是没有到小岗村，我到了滁州。当时来我记得一本那个笔记，我还都收藏着呢，印象很深刻啊，因为这是我改革开放以后啊接触农村的，可以说是这个改革的第一课。当时就是来学习。
Reviewing the history of Xiaogang village, Xi said with emotion, the thing they risked their lives to do pioneered China's road to economic reform and has become a landmark of history. China's economic reforms began in the countryside.
当前最迫切的是扩大厂矿企业和生产队的自主权。一个生产队有了经营自主权，一小块地没有种上东西，一小块水面没有利用起来搞养殖业，社员和干部就要睡不着觉，就要开动脑筋想办法。
At the end of 1978, almost at the same time that Deng Xiaoping was speaking, in this hut of Xiaogang village, 18 villagers added their thumbprint to an agreement known as the all-round contract system.
包干到户，这肯定能搞到吃的。 那是群众呢，肯定呢不会能再要饭，所以呢，我们呢就是制定了一个呢，就是欠国家的，那后集体的，剩下就是自己的。
Yan Hongchang was the deputy director of the Xiaogang production team who drew up the simple agreement that would come to have such a great historical significance. Even today, he still remembers its every single word.
我们分田到户，每户户主签字盖章。 如以后能干，每户保证完成每户的全年上缴和公粮，不再向国家伸手要钱了。如不成，我们干部坐牢杀头也甘心。大家社员也保证把我们小孩养活到18岁。
Yan Hongchang never expected the experiment he initiated would have a huge impact far beyond his own small village and become the pioneer of China's rural economic reform. One year later, Xiaogang village reaped a bumper harvest. The Xiaogang production team, which had been relying on state relief for more than 20 years, not only met its government quota for the first time, the barns of every household were filled with grain.
当时县里的县委在研究这个问题的时候也非常慎重，很少有人没有人反对的，但是有人担心，就怕这个是犯政治上的错误。
开始我这搞了以后，我怎么办？我首先跟陈云总商量的，我说我这已经搞起来了，我说怎么办？他说我双手赞成。然后我小朋友讲，小朋友说不要争论，你就这么干下去就完了。
In May 1980, Deng Xiaoping made an important speech giving his full support to the farmers' initiative. Some comrades are worried that this practice may have an adverse effect on the collective economy. I think their fears are unwarranted. Generally speaking, the main problem in rural work is still that people's thinking is not sufficiently emancipated. With Deng's backing, prohibitions were lifted to allow peasants to make decisions and experiment by themselves. By the end of 1984, more than 99% of production teams nationwide had implemented the household contract responsibility system, which was essentially the same as the all-round contract system initiated in Xiaogang village. Deng Xiaoping hailed China's rural reform as a great creation of the nation's peasants. In October 1983, the CPC Central Committee and the State Council issued Notice on the Separation of Government Administration from Commune Management and the Establishment of Township Governments, which officially put an end to the old system in which the People's Commune was both an administrative and economic unit. Following the success of rural reform, township and village enterprises emerged as a new force. Peasants adjusted their efforts to local conditions and formed their own patterns of development through trials and practices with a strong local flavor. Lu Guanqiu, the founder of Wanxiang Group in Zhejiang Province, signed a contract with the township government in which he took on all risks for a factory's operations. Under his command, the enterprise then grew into the first Chinese auto parts company to enter the American market. The rapid development of township and village enterprises brought dramatic changes to China's countryside. By 1987, the number of such enterprises nationwide had grown to more than 17.5 million. Their combined annual output value was 476.4 billion yuan, making up 50.4% of the rural economy. For the first time, the sector exceeded total agricultural output. Towns and small cities flourished with the growth of these enterprises. The structural divide between China's urban and rural areas began to change, creating conditions critical for the construction of a new countryside with Chinese characteristics. The first breakthrough of China's reform was made in the countryside. The CPC was then able to learn from the practices and innovations of peasants. It continued to push ahead, bringing profound changes to the nation's vast rural areas and unleashing their potential. Lessons from the rural reform were incorporated into China's later reform of its urban economic system, which was far more complicated. After the third plenary session of the 11th CPC Central Committee, reform of China's urban economic system was gradually pushed through nationwide, with expanded decision-making powers for enterprises as a key element. In April 1979, the CPC Central Committee and State Council decided to launch pilot reform programs in 8 large state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, in cities including Beijing, Tianjin, and Shanghai. Giving the SOEs the power to make their own decisions shook the traditional planned economy. Before the reform, they had been obliged to follow central state production planning. Afterwards, they began to study their markets, promote their products, and care about profit and loss. On June 25, 1979, Ningjiang Machine Tools Factory in Sichuan Province published an advertisement in the newspaper People's Daily, becoming the first to advertise its products since reform and opening up had begun. The factory then received an avalanche of calls, letters, and even personal visits from all over the country to place orders. Contracts for more than 1,000 sets of machine tools were signed at home and abroad. Both the factory and its workers gained substantially from improved sales. By June 1980, the experiment had expanded to include 6,600 SOEs. On September the 2nd, the State Council approved the State Economic Commission's report on the pilot program of expanding decision-making powers for enterprises and recommendations for the future, which granted all-round decision-making powers to enterprises from 1981 onwards. In 1979, a multitude of educated youths returned from the countryside to their homes in the city. To alleviate the resulting employment pressure, the central government resolved to support the development of private enterprises, as well as China's urban collective economy. With public ownership continuing to play a dominant role, diverse forms of ownership began to develop side by side. In June of the same year, Yin Shengxi, a Beijing native, quit his secure job at a sub-district government office. He then partnered with 20 educated youths who had returned from the countryside to open a tea house called Big Bowl Tea. With nostalgic branding, his cheap beverages found popularity with locals who remembered community life in the old city. In Wuhu, Anhui, meanwhile, a sole proprietor called Nian Guangzhou was building his company selling roasted sunflower seeds. He hired hundreds of staff, far exceeding what was then the legally allowed limit of 7. Against conservative voices within the party, Deng Xiaoping said putting Nian's shops out of business would cause anxiety and amount to no good. So what if we let him go on selling his seeds for a while, he asked. Will that hurt socialism?
邓小平讲话，他是为了，不是为杀了一个人，为了全国人民来指导完整。我们的事业靠党的政策，党的政策有稳定，我们的事业就发展快。
In 1981, after the Chinese government issued policies and regulations on the urban non-agricultural private economy, self-employment officially became legal. Alongside the process of reform, major breakthroughs were also made in opening China to the outside world. In July 1978, Xi Zhongshun chose Chongying Street in Guangdong's Bao'an County as the first stop of his investigative tour after he took office in the provincial government. The Hong Kong side of the street was flourishing, while the mainland side just a few meters away was depressed. The dramatic contrast inspired Xi Zhongshun to think about how to develop the Guangdong region bordering Hong Kong. In October, the Guangdong government submitted a report entitled On Foreign Trade Bases and Municipal Planning of Bao'an and Zhuhai counties to the State Council. It proposed designating the two counties as municipalities directly under the provincial government. In January 1979, Guangdong Province and the Ministry of Transport jointly submitted a report to the State Council proposing the establishment of an industrial zone in the Shekou area of Bao'an. It was approved by the central government. After much work on infrastructure construction, Shekou Industrial Zone, the first ever in China to open to the outside world, was inaugurated. In March, the State Council approved the renaming of Bao'an County in Guangdong Province as Shenzhen City. On April the 8th, Xi Zhongshun, then First Secretary of the CPC Guangdong Provincial Committee, stated in a speech at the Central Work Conference that with its location neighboring Hong Kong and Macau, and with the large number of overseas Chinese from those territories, Guangdong should actively carry out international economic and technological exchanges. He asked the central government to allow the province to make its own moves towards opening up by establishing export processing zones in the coastal cities of Shenzhen, Zhuhai and Shantou. The leadership of Fujian province also proposed to copy this model. Deng Xiaoping suggested calling them Special Economic Zones, or SEZs. He said, the central government doesn't have the funds for you, but it can provide policy support so that Guangdong is able to fight its own way to success. On August 26, 1980, the 15th meeting of the Standing Committee of the 5th National People's Congress approved the establishment of special economic zones in Shenzhen, Zhuhai and Shantou in Guangdong and Xiamen in Fujian. Years have passed since the initial struggle to build Shekou as an industrial zone. The Shenzhen Special Economic Zone has become a world-class metropolis, demonstrating the outstanding achievements of China's reform and opening up.
深圳等经济特区的成功实践，充分证明，党中央关于兴办经济特区的战略决策是完全正确的。经济特区不仅要继续办下去，而且要办得更好，办得水平更高。
1979 saw the start of economic reform in China. The new possibilities it created pushed people to think in hitherto impossible ways. On November 26, 1979, Deng Xiaoping put forward a brand new idea during an interview with an American journalist. We can develop market economy under socialism. On December 6th, during a meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Ohira Masayoshi, Deng Xiaoping emphasized that the four modernizations China was striving for were to be achieved with Chinese characteristics, and that China's goal was to become a moderately prosperous society by the end of the 20th century. Developing a market economy under socialism and building a moderately prosperous society were early manifestations of China's economic reform and modernization. With the goals outlined, the question now was which path China should take in order to achieve its objectives. On September 1st, 1982, Deng Xiaoping made an important statement in his opening speech at the 12th CPC National Congress.
把马克思主义的普遍真理同我国的具体实际结合起来，走自己的道路，建设有中国特色的社会主义。
Socialism with Chinese characteristics has been the answer to the key question of what path China should follow since its reform and opening up started. It has become the great banner guiding reform, opening up and socialist modernization in the new era. But what exactly is socialism with Chinese characteristics? A clear definition was needed. On October 20th, 1984, the third plenary session of the 12th CPC Central Committee adopted the CPC Central Committee's decision on the reform of the economic system, dismantling the false dichotomy of planned economy versus market economy, and defining for the first time the nature of China's socialist economy as a market economy based on central planning and public ownership. Deng Xiaoping hailed the document as the first draft of political economy that combined the basic principles of Marxism with China's socialist practice. He thought highly of the document, given its clarification of the socialist path China was about to take. It worked to imbue the entire nation with a spirit of optimism and vitality. The same year, Deng Xiaoping travelled south to Shenzhen, Zhuhai and Xiamen for the first time, fully affirming the results of building the SEZs. Subsequently, the central government decided to open up another 14 coastal port cities. State-owned enterprises were given more decision-making powers in operations and production. China's first generation of migrant workers left their rural homes to work in cities. Also, in 1984, China launched its first experimental communications satellite. For the first time, a Chinese scientific expedition team traveled to Antarctica. China won its first ever gold medal in the Olympic Games. The Chinese women's volleyball team won 3 consecutive World Championships, firing up the entire nation with confidence. On October 1st, 1984, a grand military parade was staged in Tiananmen Square to celebrate the 35th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. It was the 12th National Day military parade since the founding of New China and also the first of its kind in 25 years. Joining the procession, students from Peking University held high a banner that read, "Hello Xiaoping," expressing their respect and love for the great leader who had mapped the course of China's reform and opening up. Scientists and technology experts were also inspired and encouraged. In March 1986, 4 renowned Chinese scientists called on the CPC Central Committee for China to study advanced technology worldwide and develop high technology at home. They received an unequivocal reply from Deng Xiaoping. This program shall be initiated without delay.
这小平同志重视啊，所以我们报告打上去3天他就批了。这样子才国家决定花一大笔投资来从事这方面的工作。
那么我们4个人都是搞科学的，没有经费概念。这个王甘成同志因为原来是2机部兼职副部长，稍微知道一些这个概念，他说大概几千万块钱。后来张金富跟我们说，他说国务院已经初步决定准备花100个亿。
100个亿，他说是
所以我们就吓了一大跳，吓了一大跳。
China's national initiative for developing high technology was called the 863 Program, and it was approved by the central government in November 1986, with tens of thousands of scientists in different fields now working together to tackle technological challenges. China's high-tech development entered a new era. The 13th CPC National Congress was held in Beijing from October the 25th to November the 1st, 1987. For the first time in history, the Congress systematically expanded the party's theory of the primary stage of socialism and proposed economic development as the central task, with its 4 cardinal principles and policy of reform and opening up as 2 basic points for policy making during this stage. In accordance with Deng Xiaoping's vision, The Congress also defined a development strategy with a 3-stage path up to the mid-21st century to achieve China's modernization, drawing up a new blueprint for building socialism with Chinese characteristics. In its explorations into integrating the basic tenets of Marxism with the concrete realities of China, the CPC has blazed a path of socialism with Chinese characteristics. The initiation and development of this path was a great achievement of the CPC's central leadership, with Deng Xiaoping at its core, and a great result of its constant efforts to unite the Chinese nation, emancipate people's minds, and seek truth from facts in constant exploration and innovation.
从长夜到日出，走过千山万水的路，每一步都是信仰足迹，烙印下新中国版图。从贫弱到富强，走出复兴，为业征途，每一天都有奋斗牺牲，只为人民拥抱幸福，凭着心中坚定信念，敢叫日月换新天，雄关漫道，风雨无阻，汇聚起中华儿女同向前。从贫弱到富强，走出复兴，为业征途，每一天都有奋斗牺牲。